The bank statement showed negative $43 when Gabriel Marsh's 9-year-old daughter asked if they could afford dinner that wasn't canned soup, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of a child who'd learned not to burden adults with needs they couldn't meet. The overdraft notice had arrived that morning alongside the final eviction warning, 21 days to vacate the apartment where they'd been living since his wife left 18 months ago, with a note that said she couldn't handle the weight of their choices anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Gabriel looked at his daughter Lily across the kitchen table of the cramped apartment, seeing her mother in the set of her jaw, in the way she held herself too still when things were bad. She'd stopped asking about Anna months ago, had accepted with the terrible wisdom of children that some people left and didn't come back. Now she just watched Gabriel with quiet assessment, measuring whether he could keep them afloat or whether the current would finally pull them under. "We'll figure something out," he said, the words automatic and hollow. He'd been saying them for months, since the construction company he'd worked for went under, since the temp jobs dried up, since his truck's transmission failed and he couldn't afford to fix it. The apartment was already stripped bare of anything that could be sold, the walls showing rectangles where furniture used to stand. That afternoon, while Lily was at school, Gabriel sat in the public library searching rental listings he couldn't afford, his laptop held together with duct tape, the battery dying because he'd sold the charger 2 weeks ago for grocery money. He was about to close the browser when an advertisement caught his eye, different from the rental listings, stranger. County foreclosure auction, commercial property with historic designation. Riverside Tannery, 4.3 acres including main processing building and curing sheds. Minimum bid $400. Property sold as is, all environmental liens transfer to buyer. The photographs showed a massive brick structure that looked like it had been slowly dying for decades, its windows either broken or covered with plywood, its roof sagging in sections that suggested structural damage. The tannery sat on the edge of Millbrook Falls, a town Gabriel had driven through once on the way to somewhere else, a place that had the warm quality of communities the economy had forgotten. According to the county assessor's records, the Riverside Tannery had been built in 1892 by a family named Caldwell, had operated through 2 world wars processing leather for everything from boots to saddles to luxury goods. It had closed in 1978 when synthetic materials made traditional leather tanning obsolete for most uses, had sat abandoned since then, accumulating tax liens and environmental citations that made it untouchable for conventional buyers. Gabriel clicked through the environmental reports, finding language about chromium contamination and groundwater concerns, remediation requirements that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The building was a liability disguised as property, the kind of thing no sensible person would touch. But the auction was scheduled for the next morning, and $400 was less than 1 month's rent on apartments he couldn't afford anyway. It was madness. He had no experience with commercial property or environmental cleanup, no plan beyond the desperate calculation that a roof was a roof and walls were walls. But the alternative was homelessness with a 9-year-old daughter who deserved better than sleeping in a car he didn't own anymore. He spent the evening researching the tannery, finding old newspaper articles about the Caldwell family and their business. The last Caldwell to run the operation had been a man named Edmund, who'd inherited it from his father and had tried to keep it viable through the 50s and 60s by specializing in high-end leather goods. The articles painted him as a perfectionist who refused to compromise quality even when cheaper competitors were driving him out of business. One article from 1977 mentioned Edmund's mysterious death, found in the tannery after what investigators ruled was an industrial accident. He'd been 73, working alone late at night, and had apparently fallen from a second-story catwalk. The tannery had closed within months, and the property had bounced through several failed development attempts before the county seized it for unpaid taxes. The auction happened in the same courthouse where Gabriel had filed for bankruptcy 2 years earlier, trying to manage the medical debt from Lily's hospitalization when she'd had pneumonia. The room was nearly empty, maybe 8 people scattered across folding chairs, all of them looking like investors or scrappers hoping to pick up metal from industrial buildings. Gabriel sat in the back with Lily, who'd insisted on coming after he'd explained they might be bidding on a building that could become their home. She held his hand, her small fingers tight around his, both of them understanding that this was a Hail Mary thrown by someone who'd run out of conventional plays. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The auctioneer worked through properties methodically, selling vacant lots and condemned houses to buyers who knew exactly what they were acquiring. When the Riverside Tannery came up, his voice took on a warning tone. Property requires extensive environmental remediation as detailed in county reports. Buyer assumes all liability for contamination and cleanup costs. Structure is unsafe for occupation without significant repair. Minimum bid $400. Gabriel raised his hand, his heart hammering so hard he thought people in the front row could probably hear it. $400 from bidder 19. Do I hear $425? Silence filled the courthouse. Gabriel could feel eyes turning toward him, could sense the judgment of people who recognized desperation when they saw it. Going once at $400. The auctioneer paused, scanning the room. Going twice. Gabriel waited for sanity to intervene, for someone to save him from his own desperation by outbidding him. Sold to bidder 19 for $400. Lily squeezed his hand, her eyes wide. We bought a building, Dad? Yeah, sweetheart, Gabriel said, his voice not quite steady. We bought a building. At the clerk's window, he counted out $400 in 20s he'd been saving for their next rent payment, then added $25 more for processing fees and transfer costs. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Helen who looked like she'd processed 1,000 of these transactions, gave him a long look as she slid the deed across the counter. The Caldwell place, she said, not quite a question. Yes, ma'am. Helen leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice though there was no one else in line. My father worked there in the 60s. Said Edmund Caldwell was demanding but fair, paid better than most operations. Place had a reputation though. What kind of reputation? Edmund was secretive about certain aspects of the operation. Kept parts of the tannery locked up, didn't allow workers in specific areas. Some people thought he was doing illegal processing, exotic animal hides or something similar. Others figured he was just protecting trade secrets. She tapped the deed. After he died, there were rumors that he'd hidden something valuable. Treasure hunters broke in a few times over the years, never found anything. Just a lot of old equipment and chemical stains. Is it safe? The building, I mean. For my daughter. Helen's expression softened, seeing Lily waiting patiently by the door. Structurally, probably not without inspection and repair. The environmental contamination is real but mostly confined to the processing areas where they used chromium for tanning. As long as you're not stirring up old chemicals or drinking the groundwater, you should be okay in the short term. She hesitated. My nephew does building inspections if you want someone to tell you what you're actually dealing with. His card's in the information packet. The drive to the tannery took them through Millbrook Falls, a town that looked like it had peaked sometime in the 50s and had been slowly declining ever since. The storefronts on Main Street showed a mix of struggling businesses and empty buildings, the kind of economic decay Gabriel recognized from other small towns he'd passed through. The tannery sat at the edge of town where Riverside Road curved to follow Millbrook Creek. From a distance, it looked almost majestic, a 3-story brick building with industrial bones that spoke to an era when things were built to last. Up close, the decay was more evident. Broken windows, graffiti on the lower walls, sections of roof that had clearly been leaking for years. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate hung open, its padlock long since cut away by salvagers or trespassers. Gabriel parked his borrowed truck in the gravel lot where delivery vehicles had once loaded finished leather goods, looking at what he'd purchased with money that should have gone toward keeping them housed. It's really big, Lily said, her voice carrying both awe and uncertainty. It is. Probably too big for us to use most of it. But we'll find a space that's safe, make it work until we figure out what comes next. They approached the main entrance carefully, stepping over broken glass and around rusted equipment that had been abandoned in the yard. The door was secured with a newer-looking padlock, and the key Helen had given Gabriel turned smoothly despite everything else's decay. Inside, the tannery was vast and overwhelming. The main processing floor stretched out like a cathedral to industry, 2 stories of open space beneath a ceiling supported by iron beams and timber trusses. Massive wooden vats stood in rows, the vessels where leather had once been treated with tanning solutions. Old equipment filled the space, mechanized drums and drying racks and tools whose purposes Gabriel could only guess at. The smell hit him immediately, a complex mixture of old chemicals and mildew and something organic that had been soaking into the building's bones for decades. Not exactly unpleasant but deeply unfamiliar, the scent of processes and materials most of the modern world had forgotten. Light filtered through broken windows and gaps in the roof, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. Lily stayed close to Gabriel, her hand in his, both of them processing the scale of what he'd committed them to. "There's stairs," Lily said, pointing to a metal staircase that climbed to the 2nd floor. "We'll check them carefully. Buildings this old, you can't trust everything is still safe." They climbed slowly, Gabriel testing each step before letting Lily follow. The 2nd floor held what appeared to be administrative offices and storage rooms, spaces where the business side of leather tanning had happened while the processing work went on below. Most of the rooms were empty except for debris and water damage from the leaking roof. One office was larger than the others, with windows overlooking the processing floor. A desk remained, its surface warped by moisture but still intact. Filing cabinets lined one wall, most of them hanging open and empty. A framed photograph hung askew on the wall, showing a stern-looking man in work clothes standing in front of the tannery in what must have been the 1960s. "Is that Mr. Caldwell?" Lily asked. Gabriel examined the photograph more closely. Edmund Caldwell had the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands, his expression serious, his posture suggesting pride in his operation. Behind him in the photograph, barely visible, was a door Gabriel didn't remember seeing when they'd entered the building. He turned to look at the actual office wall, finding it covered with old blueprints and safety notices pinned to cork board. Nothing suggested a door. But when he pulled down the cork board, he found it, hidden behind decades of accumulated notices and papers, a door frame that had been boarded over and then covered so thoroughly that it looked like solid wall unless you knew to look for it. "Dad, what is that?" Lily's voice carried curiosity rather than fear. Gabriel ran his fingers along the edge of the covered door frame, feeling the seams. This wasn't casual boarding up. This had been deliberate concealment, the kind of thing done by someone who wanted to make sure a door was forgotten entirely. He thought about Helen's words. Treasure hunters had searched the tannery for years, never finding whatever Edmund Caldwell had supposedly hidden. Because they'd been looking for hidden rooms in obvious places, not for doors that had been sealed and disguised so well that time itself had nearly erased them. "Help me move these filing cabinets," Gabriel said. Together they pushed the heavy metal units away from the wall, revealing more of the concealed door frame. Gabriel used his pocket knife to pry away some of the boarding, finding beneath it a heavy wooden door with an old-fashioned lock. The keys Helen had given him included several that looked original to the building rather than modern additions. The 3rd key turned in the lock with a resistance that suggested decades of disuse. Gabriel pulled the door open carefully, revealing darkness and a narrow staircase descending into the building's foundation. Cool air rose from below, carrying a smell different from the tannery's chemical residue. Something metallic and almost clean, like air that had been sealed away from the decay happening in the rest of the building. Gabriel pulled out his phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam revealed stone steps leading down approximately 15 feet before opening into what appeared to be a larger space below. "Stay here," he told Lily. "No way. We're exploring together." Gabriel wanted to argue, but he recognized the determination in his daughter's face, the same stubborn insistence on facing things together that had gotten them through the past 18 months. "Stay right behind me then. If I say stop, you stop." They descended carefully, the stone steps solid despite their age. The stairs ended in a chamber approximately 20 feet square, the walls lined with brick, the ceiling supported by stone arches that suggested serious construction. Unlike the tannery above, this space showed no signs of water damage or decay. It had been sealed so completely that time had barely touched it. Metal shelves lined 3 walls, and on those shelves sat hundreds of leather-bound ledgers, each one labeled with dates ranging from 1892 through 1977. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made Gabriel's breath catch. A large iron safe, maybe 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide, sat on a platform of stone blocks. Unlike everything else in the tannery, the safe showed signs of recent maintenance, its surface oiled and preserved. A brass plate was affixed to its front, engraved with words Gabriel had to lean close to read. Edmund Caldwell, Master Tanner. What remains when skill and time meet patience? Lily squeezed Gabriel's arm. Dad, is that a treasure chest? I don't know what it is, Gabriel said honestly, though his heart was racing with possibilities he didn't dare voice. But we need to be careful about this. He examined the safe more closely, finding it had both a combination lock and a keyhole. None of the keys from his rings seemed to match the lock, and he had no combination. But as he played his flashlight around the chamber, he noticed something else. A leather journal sat on one of the shelves, newer looking than the others, with a note tucked into its cover. Gabriel opened the note carefully, finding a handwritten message in fading ink. To whoever finds this room, the combination is the year this tannery opened, followed by the year I was born. The key is hidden where all good leather begins, in the soil itself, beneath the oak that has stood longest. If you found this place, you've earned what it contains. Use it better than I did. Edmund Caldwell, 1977. Gabriel stood in the hidden chamber holding a note written by a dead man, looking at a safe that might contain nothing or might contain something that could change everything, feeling the weight of discovery and possibility settle onto shoulders that were already carrying more than they could bear. Above them, the tannery creaked in the wind, its vast spaces holding secrets Edmund Caldwell had died protecting. The building Gabriel had purchased for $425 of money he couldn't spare had just revealed itself to be something far more complicated than an abandoned industrial ruin. And whatever waited in that safe, whatever Edmund Caldwell had sealed away in 1977, was about to become Gabriel and Lily's burden to carry forward or their salvation from circumstances that had been grinding them down for 18 months. The chamber waited in silence, its secrets kept for nearly 50 years. Patient as only the buried things can be. Gabriel's first instinct was to try the combination immediately, but something held him back. Edmund Caldwell's note mentioned a key hidden beneath an oak tree, and opening a safe that had been sealed for nearly 50 years required more thought than impulse. He photographed the note and the safe with his phone, documenting everything before they'd touched anything significant, old habits from his brief time working construction where liability required evidence. We need to find the oak tree first, he told Lily. Before we try opening this. They climbed back up to the office level, Gabriel's mind racing through implications he was trying not to count on. Edmund Caldwell had been wealthy enough to own and operate a successful tannery, had died under mysterious circumstances, and had gone to elaborate lengths to hide something valuable. The safe could contain business records or personal papers. Or it could contain something that changed everything for a man who currently had negative $43 in his bank account. Outside, the November afternoon was fading toward evening, clouds gathering that promised rain before morning. The tannery property extended beyond the main building to include several smaller structures that had probably been storage sheds or curing rooms. Behind those, a line of trees marked where the property bordered Millbrook Creek. Gabriel studied the trees, looking for the oldest oak. Most were maples or willows that had probably grown wild after the tannery closed, but one massive oak stood near the creek bank, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter, its branches spreading in patterns that suggested a century or more of growth. That one, Lily said, pointing to the same tree Gabriel had identified. They approached it carefully, Gabriel scanning the ground around its base for anything that looked disturbed or marked. The soil was covered with years of fallen leaves, but near the trunk's south side, partially hidden by exposed roots, he found something that made his pulse quicken. A flat stone, maybe 18 inches square, set deliberately into the ground and marked with a simple carved C. Gabriel used a stick to clear away leaves and debris, revealing that the stone covered a small metal box embedded in the soil. The box was sealed with wax that had cracked with age but had apparently done its job of keeping moisture out. He pried it loose, feeling the weight of metal inside. The box opened to reveal a key wrapped in oilcloth, perfectly preserved after nearly 50 years buried beneath a tree. The key was ornate, old-fashioned, the kind made for locks that were built to last generations. Lily watched with the focused intensity of a child who understood they were participating in something significant. Mr. Caldwell really didn't want anyone to find this unless they looked hard. No, he didn't. Gabriel pocketed the key, looking back at the tannery that loomed against the darkening sky. Which means whatever's in that safe, he believed it was worth protecting this way. They were halfway back to the building when a truck pulled into the gravel lot, newer and cleaner than anything else in this part of Millbrook Falls. Two men got out, both wearing work clothes that were too clean, their posture suggesting they weren't here for friendly conversation. Gabriel put himself between them and Lily instinctively, his hand finding his phone in his pocket. "Can I help you?" The older of the two men stepped forward, maybe 50, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "You're the one who bought this place at auction." "I am. Name's Robert Hendricks. This is my son Paul. We've got a business proposition for you." Gabriel kept his voice neutral. "I just bought the property yesterday. Haven't even had time to assess what I'm dealing with. That's why we're here. Save you some trouble." Robert pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "We're offering to buy the tannery from you. $20,000, transfer happens within 2 weeks. You walk away with a profit and don't have to deal with environmental cleanup or structural problems." $20,000. 6 months ago, that would have seemed like salvation. Even now, it represented security Gabriel hadn't had in 18 months. But the timing was too convenient, the offer too specific. These men had been waiting for someone to buy the tannery at auction, had come prepared with an offer that suggested they knew something about the property's value. "Why do you want it?" Gabriel asked. "Investment. We develop commercial properties, see potential in this location. The land itself is valuable even if the building needs to be demolished." "And you're offering $20,000 for property you plan to demolish?" Robert's expression hardened slightly. "We're offering a fair price for a property with significant liabilities. The environmental cleanup alone will cost you hundreds of thousands. The building's not safe for occupation. You're in over your head, and we're giving you an out." Paul spoke up for the first time, his voice carrying an edge his father's didn't. "People who refuse help when it's offered sometimes find things getting more difficult. Permits get delayed, inspections find problems, small towns can be complicated for outsiders." Gabriel felt Lily press against his back, her small hand gripping his jacket. The threat was barely veiled, the kind of pressure applied by people who were used to getting what they wanted through intimidation when money didn't work. "I need to think about it," Gabriel said, keeping his voice level. "You've got 48 hours. Robert handed him the paper. "After that, the offer expires and you're on your own with all the problems this place brings." After they left, Gabriel stood in the gravel lot holding an offer for money he desperately needed, knowing that accepting it meant surrendering whatever Edmund Caldwell had hidden in that chamber. The Hendricks family had been waiting for someone to buy the tannery, had come prepared to pressure a quick sale, which meant they knew or suspected something about what the building contained. "Are we going to sell?" Lily asked quietly. "I don't know yet. But we're not making that decision until we know what we actually have." That night, they camped in the tannery's least damaged office space, using sleeping bags Gabriel had kept from better days and a camping stove to heat canned soup. It wasn't comfortable, probably violated every safety regulation in existence, but it was theirs, and it was shelter when the alternative was sleeping in a borrowed truck. After Lily fell asleep, Gabriel sat in the darkness thinking about the combination Edmund Caldwell had left. The year the tannery opened, 1892, followed by Edmund's birth year. He didn't know Edmund's birth year, but Helen at the courthouse might, or the obituary from 1977 would have that information. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the safe and what it might contain and whether the Hendricks offer was legitimate or whether they were trying to steal something valuable from someone too desperate to fight back. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and descended to the hidden chamber alone, his phone's flashlight illuminating the space Edmund Caldwell had sealed away. The ledgers on the shelves represented decades of meticulous record-keeping, each one documenting tanning operations with the kind of detail that suggested pride and craft. Gabriel pulled one from the early 1900s, finding page after page of orders and specifications, notes about leather quality and customer satisfaction, a business run with precision and care. He found Edmund's birth year in a ledger from 1904, April 12, 1904, son of Harrison Caldwell, born into the business that would define his life. Which meant the combination was 1892 to 1904. Gabriel stood before the safe, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the dial. Right to 18, left to 92, right to 19, left to 04. The lock mechanism clicked with surprising smoothness, suggesting Edmund had maintained it even as the rest of the tannery decayed. Gabriel inserted the key he'd found beneath the oak tree, and it turned with the same well-oiled precision. The safe door swung open, revealing contents that made Gabriel's breath catch. Not gold bars or jewelry or the kind of treasure he'd half expected. Instead, stacked neatly on the safe's shelves, were bundles of currency. Old $100 bills, bound with paper bands that had Edmund Caldwell's handwriting noting dates and amounts. Gabriel pulled out one bundle, his hands shaking now. The bills were real, were old but preserved, were 50 of them bound together with a note that read 1977 final profits before closure. He counted bundles, his mind struggling with mathematics that seemed impossible. 50 bills per bundle, maybe 100 bundles stacked in careful rows. $500,000, give or take. Possibly more. Edmund Caldwell had converted his entire operation to cash before closing, had hidden it in his chamber, and had died before retrieving it or telling anyone where it was. For nearly 50 years, $500,000 had sat beneath a building nobody wanted, waiting for someone desperate enough to buy a foreclosed tannery at auction. Gabriel sat on the cold stone floor, surrounded by more money than he'd earned in 20 years of construction work, trying to process what this meant. The Hendricks family knew. Or suspected. Their $20,000 offer was an insult if they knew what was actually hidden here, or it was a gamble if they only suspected and wanted to acquire the property to search properly. But the money was legally his. The property transfer had been legitimate, and anything contained on the property belonged to the new owner unless specifically excluded. Edmund's note had been clear, to whoever finds this room, which meant it had been intended as inheritance for someone, even if Edmund hadn't known who. Dawn found Gabriel still in the chamber, having counted and recounted the money, having photographed everything for documentation, having read through more of Edmund's ledgers looking for context. The story that emerged was of a man who'd seen his industry dying, who'd liquidated his operation systematically over several years, converting equipment and inventory and business assets to cash. The ledgers from 1975 to 1977 showed Edmund preparing for closure, paying off debts, settling with employees, methodically dismantling a business his family had run for 85 years. The final entry, dated March 1977, simply read, "The work ends. The provision continues. May it find someone worthy." Gabriel climbed back to the office level as morning light filtered through broken windows, finding Lily awake and eating a granola bar from their dwindling supplies. She took one look at his face and knew something had changed. "You opened it." "Yeah." "What was inside?" Gabriel sat beside her, choosing honesty because she'd earned it through everything they'd survived together. "Money. A lot of money. More than I can really process right now." Lily's eyes widened. "Like how much?" "Enough that we never have to worry about rent or food or whether I can fix the truck. Enough that you can go to any college you want someday. Enough that everything changes." She was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the seriousness she applied to important things. "But the men yesterday, they want to buy the tannery because they know about the money." "I think so, yeah. Or they suspect." So what do we do? It was the question Gabriel had been asking himself since opening the safe. The practical answer was to take the money, sell the property to the Hendricks family for their $20,000, and disappear before anyone realized what had been found. But Edmund's note echoed in his mind, "Use it better than I did." "I need to talk to someone who knew Edmund Caldwell," Gabriel said. "Understand why he did this, what he was protecting the money for. Then we decide." Helen at the courthouse gave him a name, Margaret Brennan, who'd been Edmund's bookkeeper for 20 years and still lived in Millbrook Falls. Gabriel found her in a small house near the creek, a woman in her 80s with sharp eyes and clear memories of the man who'd employed her. Edmund was complicated, Margaret said after Gabriel explained he'd purchased the tannery. Brilliant at his craft, terrible at relationships. The tannery was his life, and when it became clear traditional leather tanning couldn't compete with modern methods, it broke something in him. He converted everything to cash before closing. "Do you know why?" Margaret's expression grew guarded. "There were rumors." Edmund didn't trust banks after the Depression, even though he was too young to remember it personally. He believed in tangible assets, things you could hold and control. She paused. "Did you find something at the tannery?" Gabriel made a decision to trust her. "A hidden chamber. A safe. A lot of money that Edmund left behind with a note saying whoever found it should use it better than he did." Margaret's eyes glistened. "He did it then. He actually managed to hide his emergency fund where those vultures couldn't find it." "What vultures?" "The Hendricks family. Robert's father was pressuring Edmund to sell in the 70s, wanted the land for development. Edmund refused, said the tannery represented something that mattered more than profit. When Edmund died, the Hendricks tried to buy the property from the estate, but the environmental liens made it too complicated." Margaret leaned forward. "Robert's been waiting 40 years for that property to go to foreclosure, for someone desperate enough to buy it who he could pressure into a quick resale. He offered me $20,000 yesterday. Which tells you he suspects what's there but hasn't found it himself." Edmund's death was ruled accidental, but there were always questions. He was found in the tannery, fallen from a catwalk, but Edmund was careful and experienced. Some people thought he was murdered, that someone had tried to force him to reveal where he'd hidden his money. The implications chilled Gabriel. "And you think that someone was connected to the Hendricks family?" "I think Edmund died protecting something he believed mattered. The money, yes, but also the principle that his life's work shouldn't be stolen by people who saw it only as profit." Margaret's expression was fierce despite her age. "If you found what Edmund hid, you've inherited more than money. You've inherited a fight he died fighting." After leaving Margaret's house, Gabriel drove back to the tannery with Lily beside him, his mind churning through impossible decisions. The money could change their lives, but it also made them targets for people who'd been waiting decades to acquire what Edmund had hidden. Selling to the Hendricks would be the safe choice, but it would mean surrendering to exactly the kind of pressure Edmund had resisted. They found Robert Hendricks waiting at the tannery, his son and 2 other men with him. Not a social visit. Robert's expression was harder than yesterday, his patience apparently exhausted. "Time's up for friendly offers," Robert said. "We know you found something. Security cameras we installed years ago caught you going into parts of the building that should be sealed. You're going to sell us this property for what we offered, or you're going to discover how complicated life gets for people who don't cooperate." Gabriel felt Lily press against him, felt the weight of Edmund Caldwell's legacy and his own daughter's future pulling in different directions. "The property's legally mine. Whatever I found is legally mine. You can make threats all you want, but I haven't broken any laws." Paul stepped forward, his posture aggressive. "You think the law matters in Millbrook Falls? My family employs half this town, sits on every board that matters. We can make you wish you'd never heard of this tannery. Can you?" Gabriel pulled out his phone, showing the recording he'd started when he saw their trucks in the lot. Because threatening someone on camera, admitting to illegal surveillance, that seems like the kind of thing that might interest state police. "And I've got documentation of everything I found, photographs time-stamped and uploaded to cloud storage." Anything happens to me or my daughter, it all goes public. Robert's face darkened, but he took a step back, calculating. You're making a mistake. That money isn't yours by right. Edmund Caldwell didn't earn it honestly, he was laundering profits, hiding income from taxes. You keep it, you're complicit in tax fraud. Edmund's ledgers show every transaction, every tax payment, everything documented properly. He liquidated a legitimate business and chose to keep his money in cash. That's not illegal, just unusual. Gabriel kept his voice steady despite his hammering heart. But if you want to claim otherwise, do it through proper legal channels. Until then, stay off my property. After they left, Gabriel stood shaking with adrenaline and fear, knowing he'd just made enemies of people who'd been waiting 40 years to get what he'd found. Lily hugged him tightly, her small frame trembling. Are we safe? She asked. For now. The recording gives us leverage, and they know I've documented everything. They can't just take what they want without risking exposure. Gabriel knelt to meet her eyes. But we need to be smart about this. Move the money somewhere secure, get legal advice, make sure we're protected. That night, after moving the money to a safety deposit box in the next county, after consulting with a lawyer who confirmed that found property transferred with legitimate property ownership, after installing security cameras and motion sensors around the tannery, Gabriel sat with Lily in their makeshift living space. Edmund Caldwell died protecting this, he said. Not just the money, but the principle that some things are worth standing for even when powerful people want to take them. I think about that, about whether I'm strong enough to do what he did. Lily was quiet for a moment, then said something that cut through all his uncertainty. Mom left because things got hard. She chose the easy path and left us behind. You're choosing to stand for something even though it's scary. That's the difference between her and you. Gabriel pulled his daughter close, feeling the weight of her trust and the burden of the choice he was making. The money could buy them security, but keeping it meant fighting people who had resources and patience and 40 years of anger driving them. Edmund Caldwell had fought that fight alone and had died for it. But Gabriel wasn't alone. He had Lily, had legal documentation, had evidence of the Hendricks threats and illegal surveillance. He had the truth about Edmund's legitimate business practices, had a community that remembered the tannery's better days, had the law on his side if he was brave enough to invoke it. The tannery stood in the darkness, its brick walls holding secrets that had finally been revealed, its foundations solid despite decades of neglect. Gabriel had bought it for $425 because he was desperate and had nowhere else to go. Now it had given him something Edmund Caldwell had believed was worth dying to protect, not just money, but the principle that some inheritances came with obligations that extended beyond personal benefit. The fight wasn't over. The Hendricks would regroup, would find new ways to pressure and threaten, would make life difficult in the way small-town power could make things difficult. But Gabriel had faced hardship before, had survived his wife's abandonment and financial ruin and the slow erosion of everything he thought was stable. This fight, at least, was for something that mattered. For his daughter's future, for Edmund Caldwell's legacy, for the principle that desperate people who stumbled into good fortune deserved the chance to keep it if they were brave enough to stand their ground. The tannery waited, patient as only old buildings can be, ready to shelter the next chapter of a story that had started with a card game in 1892 and had just found its latest unlikely inheritor in a man who'd had nothing left to lose except the ground he stood on. The lawyer's name was Patricia Owens, and she'd been practicing in the county seat for 30 years, long enough to know the Hendricks family's reputation. She reviewed Gabriel's documentation with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details mattered when powerful people wanted something you had. Edmund Caldwell's estate was settled in 1978, she said, spreading papers across her desk. All debts paid, all taxes current at the time of his death. The money you found was his personal assets, legally earned and properly taxed. The fact that he chose to keep it in cash rather than banks is unusual but not illegal. Gabriel felt some of the tension in his chest ease. So the Hendricks can't claim it was hidden to avoid taxes? They can claim whatever they want, but the burden of proof would be on them. Edmund's ledgers show meticulous record-keeping, including quarterly tax payments through 1977. Unless they can prove otherwise, the money is yours as part of the property transfer. Patricia leaned back in her chair. However, there's a complication you should know about. Gabriel waited, familiar enough with complications to know they rarely came alone. The environmental cleanup requirements are real. The county has authority to condemn the property if remediation isn't begun within a certain time frame. That gives the Hendricks leverage. They could pressure the county to accelerate that timeline, force you into a position where you can't afford cleanup and have to sell. How much would proper remediation cost? Conservatively? $200,000, possibly more depending on how extensive the contamination is. The chromium used in traditional leather tanning was toxic, and the EPA has strict requirements for cleanup. She paused. The money you found would cover it, but you'd be investing a substantial portion of your windfall into a property that may have limited commercial value afterward. Gabriel thought about this, about the irony of finding $500,000 only to have to spend nearly half of it making the building that contained it safe. But he also thought about Edmund Caldwell spending decades building something that mattered, about the principle of not letting the Hendricks take what they hadn't earned. What if I did the cleanup properly? What leverage would they have then? Patricia smiled slightly. None, legally. If you remediate the environmental issues and bring the building up to code, the property is yours free and clear. They'd have to give up or find another angle. Over the next 3 months, Gabriel learned more about environmental remediation than he'd ever wanted to know. He hired specialists who assessed the contamination, developed cleanup plans, and began the slow work of removing contaminated soil and treating affected areas. The process was expensive and tedious, but it was also transformative. Watching the tannery shed its toxic legacy felt like participating in something larger than himself. Lily adapted to their new circumstances with the flexibility of children who'd learned to expect change. She enrolled in Millbrook Falls Elementary, made friends with the ease that came from having stopped being afraid of temporary connections. The money meant Gabriel could afford proper housing, but Lily insisted they stay at the tannery, camping in increasingly comfortable sections as he made each area safe and livable. "This is our place," she said when he suggested renting something temporary. "We found Mr. Caldwell's treasure together. We should stay where it happened." The community's response to their presence evolved slowly. Some people remembered Edmund Caldwell fondly, were glad to see the tannery occupied again. Others were loyal to the Hendricks family and treated Gabriel with suspicion. The divide revealed itself in small ways: which businesses served him readily, which suddenly had reasons why they couldn't help with various needs. Bill Morrison, who ran the hardware store, became an unexpected ally. He'd worked at the tannery as a teenager in the 60s, remembered Edmund as demanding but fair. "Taught me more about quality work in 2 summers than I learned anywhere else," Bill said, helping Gabriel select materials for repairs. The Hendricks wanted that land for years, but Edmund knew they'd just tear down the tannery and build something cheap. He believed buildings like that mattered, that craftsmanship deserved respect. Through Bill, Gabriel learned more about Edmund's final years. The man had become increasingly isolated as his industry died, had refused to adapt or modernize, had chosen to close his operation rather than compromise the quality that had defined his work. He'd died alone in the building he loved, and whether that death was accident or something darker remained a question local people debated in quiet conversations. The environmental cleanup took 6 months and cost $230,000. Gabriel watched his windfall diminish with each payment, investing Edmund's hidden fortune back into the building that had held it. But as contaminated soil was removed and replaced, as testing showed the property returning to safe levels, he felt something shift. This wasn't just spending money, it was honoring a trust Edmund had placed in whoever found his hidden chamber. Robert Hendricks tried one more approach in April, appearing at the tannery on a spring morning when Gabriel was overseeing the final remediation work. His posture was different this time, less aggressive and more weary, the stance of a man who'd been fighting too long for something he was starting to question. "The cleanup's almost done," Robert said, "not quite a question. Should be certified clear next week. Then you'll have a clean property with no environmental liens." Quite an accomplishment for someone who bought it for $400 at auction. Gabriel didn't respond, waiting to see where this conversation was heading. My father spent 40 years trying to acquire this land. Told me stories about how Edmund Caldwell cheated us out of a fair sale, how the tannery should have been ours to develop. Robert looked at the building with an expression Gabriel couldn't quite read. I believed him, made it my mission to finish what he started. But lately I've been wondering if we were both just chasing something that never mattered as much as we convinced ourselves it did. Why tell me this? Because my son Paul is starting to talk the same way my father did, making the tannery into some kind of symbol of family honor that was stolen. I see the same obsession taking root in him, and I'm tired of it. Robert met Gabriel's eyes. I'm withdrawing our interest in this property. No more pressure, no more threats. You won the fight fair, and Paul needs to learn that some battles aren't worth the cost of winning. After Robert left, Gabriel stood in the tannery's yard trying to process the strange victory. He'd prepared for continued conflict, for legal battles and escalating pressure. The sudden absence of threat felt disorienting, like tensing for impact that never came. Margaret Brennan visited that afternoon, her eyes bright with something approaching vindication. Robert Hendricks came to see me last week. Asked about Edmund, about what kind of man he'd really been. I think he finally started questioning the stories his father told him. What did you tell him? The truth. That Edmund was difficult and stubborn, but honest. That he closed his business rather than cut corners or sell to people he didn't respect. That he died protecting something he believed mattered, not just money, but principles about craft and quality, and refusing to surrender to people who only saw profit where he saw legacy. Margaret pulled an envelope from her bag. I also have something for you. Edmund gave this to me in early 1977, said if anyone ever found his hidden chamber, I should give it to them. I've been holding it for 47 years, wondering if this day would come. The envelope was sealed with wax, Edmund's initials pressed into it. Inside was a letter written in the same precise hand as the note Gabriel had found in the chamber. To the finder of my provision, if you're reading this, you've demonstrated the kind of thoroughness and attention to detail that I valued in my work. You found the hidden door that others missed, solved the puzzle I left, claimed what I couldn't bear to entrust to banks or family who never understood what I built here. The money represents 50 years of careful work, of refusing to compromise quality for profit, of building something that mattered even when the market moved toward cheaper alternatives. I converted it to cash because I believed in tangible assets, in wealth you could hold and count, in security that didn't depend on institutions that might fail. But money alone isn't the inheritance I'm leaving. The real value is in understanding why I did this, why I chose to hide my life's earnings rather than surrender them to people who'd use them to erase what I built. The tannery represents an era of craftsmanship that's disappearing, of work done with patience and pride and attention to detail that modern manufacturing doesn't value. If you're using this money wisely, you're not just enriching yourself. You're honoring a principle that some things matter more than profit, that buildings and skills and ways of working deserve protection even when they're no longer economically optimal. Keep the tannery if you can. Preserve what I built if it's possible. Or at minimum, ensure that whatever replaces it respects the fact that this place represented something beyond simple commerce. I'm dying as I write this, not physically yet but in the way that matters. My life's work is becoming obsolete, my skills irrelevant, my building increasingly empty of purpose. The money is my final act of defiance against that obsolescence, my way of ensuring that at least some value persists even after the craft itself dies. Use it better than I did. I buried it when I should have invested it in teaching others, in preserving the knowledge that dies with my generation. Learn from my mistake. Whatever you do with this inheritance, let it build something rather than simply hide something. Edmund Caldwell, January 1977. Gabriel read the letter 3 times, feeling the weight of Edmund's trust settle onto shoulders that were stronger now than when he'd arrived in Millbrook Falls. The money had saved him from immediate desperation, but Edmund's real gift was the understanding that inheritance came with obligation, not legal obligation, but moral imperative to honor the trust placed in whoever found his hidden chamber. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed in the bedroom Gabriel had built in the safest section of the tannery, he sat in Edmund's old office thinking about what to build with the money that remained. The environmental cleanup had consumed nearly half, but $270,000 still represented security beyond anything he'd imagined 6 months ago. He could sell the tannery now, walk away with the remaining money and start fresh somewhere else. The building had served its purpose, had sheltered them and yielded its treasure. But Edmund's letter echoed in his mind, "Use it better than I did." Over the next year, Gabriel began transforming the tannery with the same methodical care Edmund had applied to his craft. He hired local contractors, people who remembered the building's working days and wanted to see it honored rather than demolished. They repaired the roof section by section, replaced broken windows with period-appropriate materials, reinforced the structure while preserving its industrial character. The work was slow and deliberate, motivated not by profit but by the principle Edmund had died protecting. Gabriel documented everything, photographing the restoration process, researching the tanning industry to understand what the building had been designed for. Lily helped, her interest in the project deepening as she learned about the craft that had filled these spaces. Did people really make everything from leather? She asked one evening while examining tools Gabriel had found and restored. Not just boots and belts, but all kinds of things? Everything from saddles to book bindings to machine belts before rubber was common. Edmund specialized in high-quality goods, leather for craftspeople who still valued traditional materials. Gabriel showed her one of the ledgers from the 1960s, orders for bookbinders and saddle makers and upholsterers who wanted materials made properly. Could we do that again? Make leather the old way? The question surprised Gabriel, opened possibilities he hadn't considered. I don't know how. Edmund's skills died with him. But Lily's enthusiasm planted a seed. Gabriel started researching traditional tanning, finding that while the chromium-based industrial process Edmund had used was toxic and obsolete, older vegetable tanning methods were experiencing a renaissance among craftspeople who valued sustainability and traditional materials. There were people who still practiced these methods, who taught them, who believed leather made properly had qualities synthetic materials couldn't replicate. He found Marcus Whitley, a master tanner in Pennsylvania who'd learned vegetable tanning from one of the last traditional practitioners. Marcus visited the tannery in the fall, his eyes lighting up when he saw the equipment Edmund had left behind. "This is remarkable," Marcus said, examining the wooden tanning vats that Gabriel had carefully preserved. "Most buildings like this were demolished decades ago. You've got infrastructure here that could be adapted for vegetable tanning, could train people in methods that are nearly extinct. You'd be willing to teach that?" "I've been looking for a permanent facility where I could train apprentices, preserve knowledge before my generation takes it to the grave like Edmund did." Marcus paused. "If you're serious about this, about honoring what this building represented, I'd be interested in partnering. Use your space, share the knowledge, create something that connects traditional craft to modern values." The partnership formed slowly, carefully, built on shared understanding that this was about more than profit. Marcus moved to Millbrook Falls the following spring, bringing equipment and expertise. They converted sections of the tannery to vegetable tanning operations, sustainable processes that used tree bark and thyme rather than toxic chemicals. The teaching component evolved naturally. Craftspeople started coming to learn, drawn by the rare opportunity to study traditional tanning in a facility designed for it. Lily, now 12, became Marcus's informal assistant, learning techniques that connected her to something Edmund Caldwell had understood, that some knowledge was worth preserving even when the world had moved on. 2 years after Gabriel had bought the tannery for $425, they held a small celebration marking the building's transformation. Local people came, some who'd worked there under Edmund, others who'd watched it decay and were glad to see it alive again. Even Robert Hendricks attended, accompanied by his son Paul, both wearing expressions of complicated acceptance. "My father would hate this," Robert said, watching demonstrations of traditional leathermaking. "He wanted this land for condos or commercial development, something profitable. But watching what you've built, I think maybe Edmund knew what he was doing when he hid that money." Paul was quieter, studying the restored equipment and the craftspeople learning skills his grandfather had dismissed as obsolete. "We wasted 40 years fighting over this," he said finally. "Time we could have spent building something that mattered instead of just trying to tear down what someone else built." After the celebration, Gabriel and Lily stood on the second-floor catwalk where Edmund had fallen to his death, looking down at the tannery floor that now held activity and purpose again. The building breathed differently than it had when Gabriel first entered, no longer abandoned but alive, serving a function Edmund would have recognized even if the specifics had evolved. "Do you think Mr. Caldwell knew someone like us would find his treasure?" Lily asked. "I think he hoped. He created the puzzle, left the clues, trusted that whoever was desperate enough to buy a foreclosed tannery would be thorough enough to find what he'd hidden." Gabriel put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "He gave us more than money. He gave us purpose, something to build that's bigger than just ourselves." The years continued their steady progression. The tannery became known among craftspeople, a rare facility where traditional skills were taught and preserved. The business wasn't hugely profitable, but it was sustainable, employed local people, drew visitors who spent money in Millbrook Falls and helped stabilize a town that had been slowly dying. Lily flourished in ways Gabriel could never have predicted when they'd arrived desperate and displaced. She became skilled in vegetable tanning, developed a reputation for quality work that honored Edmund's standards. She talked about studying material science in college, about finding ways to bridge traditional craft with modern sustainability, about keeping the tannery operating while expanding its mission. Gabriel had used the remainder of Edmund's money carefully, investing in the building's restoration and the teaching programs, living modestly despite wealth that would have allowed luxury. He'd found purpose in the work, in preserving something Edmund had believed was worth dying to protect, in giving Lily a foundation that went beyond financial security. Margaret Brennan died peacefully at 91, her last words to Gabriel a reminder that Edmund would have been proud. "You understood what he was trying to preserve. Not just a building or money, but principles about craft and quality and refusing to surrender when powerful people demand it." On a warm evening in late spring, 5 years after buying the tannery at auction, Gabriel sat in Edmund's restored office reading through the ledgers that documented a century of leather making. The entries ended abruptly in March 1977, Edmund's final notation about closure and provision, the last words of a man preparing to hide his life's earnings in a chamber he might not live to open. But the story hadn't ended there. It had continued through Gabriel's desperate purchase, through Lily's discovery of the hidden door, through the choice to stand rather than sell, through years of careful restoration and teaching and preservation. Edmund's legacy hadn't died when he fell from that catwalk. It had waited, patient as only buried things can be, for someone worthy to claim it. The tannery stood solid in the evening light, its brick walls holding stories that spanned generations, its spaces filled with the sound of craft being practiced and taught. The building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat toxic and abandoned for 40 years, had been reborn through stubbornness and vision and the kind of courage that came from having nothing to lose except principles you refused to surrender. Gabriel thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction, about rocks through windows that hadn't come because the fight had ended differently, about choices made and ground held. He thought about Edmund dying alone, protecting treasure and principle in equal measure, trusting that eventually someone would come along who'd understand why it mattered. That someone had been him, though he'd arrived broken and desperate, though he'd almost chosen the easier path of selling and walking away. But Lily had helped him see what Edmund had seen, that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit, that true wealth lay in building something that honored the trust placed in you. The land kept its secrets still, the creek flowing past the tannery as it had for centuries, the oak tree standing where Edmund had buried his key, the soil remembering everything that had happened here. But it had also given what mattered most, the opportunity to build something meaningful, and people stubborn enough to do the building. As darkness settled over Millbrook Falls and the tannery's lights glowed warm against the night, Gabriel felt the weight of 5 years settle into something approaching peace. Not satisfaction exactly, because there was always more work to do, always knowledge to preserve and skills to teach. But contentment with choices made and ground held, with a daughter who'd found purpose in a building that had found new life. Edmund Caldwell's treasure had saved them from immediate desperation, but his real gift was understanding that inheritance meant more than receiving. It meant choosing to honor what had been entrusted to you, to build rather than simply consume, to preserve what deserved preservation even when the world had moved on to easier alternatives. The tannery would stand long after Gabriel was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge that connected present craft to centuries of tradition. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you own but what you built, not what you inherited but what you chose to protect and pass forward. Gabriel stood in Edmund's office, holding ledgers that documented a life of careful work, feeling the continuity between that life and his own. The money had been spent wisely, invested in restoration and teaching, used better than Edmund had managed. The building breathed with purpose, its toxic legacy cleaned away, its spaces filled with people learning skills that would have died without this preservation. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in brick and leather, in patient craftsmanship and stubborn refusal to let important knowledge disappear. Edmund had held this ground until it could be passed to someone who'd understand. Gabriel had held it until Lily could claim it as her own heritage. Lily would hold it for whoever came next, creating continuity that transformed individual struggle into something larger than any one life. The tannery stood as proof that what was worth defending could be defended, that heritage could survive through choice and commitment, that sometimes desperate gambles made by broken people led to places nobody could have predicted but everyone could recognize as right. 10 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on the tannery the way water shapes stone. Gabriel watched Lily grow from the 9-year-old girl who'd helped him find Edmund Caldwell's hidden chamber to a 19-year-old young woman whose hands bore the calluses of someone who'd spent a decade learning traditional leather craft. The transformation wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of thing you notice day by day, but when Gabriel looked at photographs from that first desperate winter camping in the abandoned building, he barely recognized the scared man and frightened child they'd been. The tannery had transformed with them. What had been toxic abandonment was now thriving preservation, what had been decay was now purpose. The main processing floor operated daily, vegetable tanning vats filled with solutions made from tree bark and water and thyme, craftspeople from across the country coming to learn methods most of the world had forgotten. The teaching workshops ran year-round, the building breathing with the sound of work and conversation, the smell of natural tanning processes replacing the chemical residue that had poisoned the ground for decades. Lily had become the tannery's youngest master tanner at 18, certified by Marcus Whitley and a board of traditional craftspeople who'd tested her skills and found them exceptional. She'd developed an intuitive understanding of how leather responded to different treatments, could read the grain and quality of hides the way others read books. Her work had been featured in craft journals, her techniques studied by people trying to bridge traditional methods with modern sustainability. Gabriel had found his own purpose over those years. He managed the tannery's operations, handled the business side that allowed them to run sustainably while keeping fees accessible for students who couldn't afford expensive tuition. He'd also become something of an expert in historic industrial building preservation, consulting with other communities trying to save structures the economy had abandoned. The remainder of Edmund's money had been invested carefully. Some went to establishing a scholarship fund for traditional craft education, ensuring that students like the person he'd been, broke and desperate, could still learn skills that mattered. Some went to maintaining the building properly, preventing the kind of neglect that had nearly destroyed it. The rest sat invested conservatively, providing security without extravagance, allowing them to make decisions based on principles rather than financial pressure. On a warm evening in late May, 15 years after Gabriel had bought the tannery at auction, they held what had become an annual tradition. The Caldwell Memorial Gathering, a day when the tannery opened to the community, when craftspeople demonstrated traditional techniques, when the building celebrated not just its survival but its rebirth as something Edmund would have recognized and valued. Robert Hendricks attended, as he had for the past 5 years, his presence no longer uncomfortable but accepted. He was older now, semi-retired, having handed most of his business operations to Paul, who'd proven less interested in development and more interested in historic preservation after seeing what Gabriel had built. Edmund would have appreciated this, Robert said, watching Lily teach a group of students how to evaluate high quality. Not because you're making money from it, but because you're keeping something alive that should have died when he did. Gabriel had learned over the years that Robert's obsession with the tannery had been about more than land or profit. It had been about his father's failure, about inherited anger that had defined 3 generations of Hendrick's men. Breaking that cycle had freed something in Robert, had allowed him to see the tannery not as property stolen but as heritage preserved. "Your son seems genuinely interested in what we're doing here," Gabriel observed, watching Paul document the teaching process with a professional camera. "He's writing a book about Millbrook Falls industrial heritage, how buildings like this represent something worth saving even when they're not economically optimal." Robert paused. "He interviewed me last month about my family's history with the tannery. First time I've talked honestly about the obsession that drove my father and grandfather. First time I've admitted it was always more about pride than principle." After Robert moved on to examine other demonstrations, Margaret Brennan's niece Sarah approached, carrying a box she'd promised to bring. Margaret had died 7 years ago, but Sarah had inherited her aunt's careful record-keeping and her commitment to preserving Millbrook Falls history. "Aunt Margaret left instructions that this should go to you after enough time had passed," Sarah said, handing Gabriel the box. "She didn't specify how much time, just said you'd know when you were ready to understand what it contained." Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by Edmund Caldwell over the years to Margaret. Personal correspondence that revealed the man behind the perfectionist reputation, his struggles with watching his industry die, his determination to protect what he'd built even when protection meant hiding rather than using. Gabriel read through them that evening after the gathering had ended, Lily reading over his shoulder, both of them learning more about the man whose hidden fortune had changed their lives. Edmund had been lonely, had poured his life into his craft at the expense of personal relationships, had died alone because he'd never learned to value people the way he'd valued quality work. One letter, dated just weeks before his death, carried particular weight. "Margaret, I'm preparing to seal the chamber tomorrow. Everything is ready, the money converted, the safe installed, the clues arranged for whoever might be clever enough to find them. I tell myself this is about protecting assets from those who'd misuse them, but truthfully, it's about legacy. I'm dying slowly, my craft dying with me, and I can't bear the thought that it will all just disappear as if it never mattered. The money is my final act of faith, faith that someone will come along who understands that some things are worth preserving even when the world has moved on. If you're reading this after my death and no one has found the chamber, perhaps my faith was misplaced. But I had to try. I had to believe that craftsmanship and quality and careful work still matter to someone, somewhere." Lily set down the letter, her expression thoughtful. "He died believing his work might not matter to anyone. That's really sad." "But he was wrong," Gabriel said. "His work mattered to Marcus, who learned from masters Edmund would have known. It matters to you and the students who come here. It matters to a whole community of craftspeople who are keeping traditional methods alive. Because we found his money and used it the way he hoped we would." "No," Gabriel corrected gently. "Because Edmund built something solid enough to survive 40 years of abandonment, because he left clues that preserved the possibility of resurrection, because he had faith that someone would understand what was worth saving. The money helped, but the real inheritance was the building itself and what it represented." The following year brought changes that felt like completion of cycles that had started before Gabriel arrived. Marcus Whitley decided to retire from active teaching, though he remained as an advisor and occasional instructor. He recommended Lily to take over the master tanner position, to become the lead educator for the program they'd built together. "You've learned everything I could teach you," Marcus said during the formal transition. "More importantly, you understand why it matters. Edmund died without passing on his knowledge, let his skills die with him. You won't make that mistake." Paul Hendricks's book was published that spring, a thoughtful examination of how small-town industrial buildings represented more than just economics, how they held stories and knowledge and community identity that deserved preservation. The chapter about the tannery was honest about his family's decades-long attempt to acquire it, frank about the obsession that had driven 3 generations to fight over land they'd convinced themselves had been stolen. "My grandfather believed Edmund Caldwell cheated his family out of a legitimate business opportunity," Paul wrote. my father inherited that belief, and I grew up hearing it as established fact. But researching this book forced me to examine what evidence actually existed versus what we'd convinced ourselves to believe. The truth is probably unknowable after so much time, but what's clear is that Edmund built something of value through honest work, and my family spent generations trying to take it rather than building something of their own. The book's publication created conversations in Millbrook Falls about other buildings that might be worth preserving, other histories that deserved documentation before they were lost entirely. Paul established a nonprofit focused on industrial heritage preservation, using proceeds from the book to fund projects throughout the region. Gabriel found himself serving on the nonprofit's board, alongside Robert Hendricks in what would have seemed impossible 15 years earlier, working together to preserve rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "We wasted so much time fighting," Robert said during one board meeting, discussing a shuttered mill that showed promise for adaptive reuse. "Time we could have spent doing this kind of work, creating value instead of trying to steal it from others." On a cool October morning, 20 years after Gabriel had arrived in Millbrook Falls with Lily and nothing else, they received a visit from someone unexpected. Anna, Gabriel's ex-wife, appeared at the Tannery's entrance, older and carrying herself with the uncertain posture of someone who wasn't sure of her welcome. Lily saw her first, her expression going carefully neutral in the way it did when she was processing complicated emotions. "Mom's here." Gabriel joined his daughter at the window, seeing the woman who'd left them when things got hard, who'd chosen escape over the difficulty of staying. He felt Lily tense beside him, waiting to see how he'd respond, whether he'd turn away the mother who'd abandoned her or whether he'd demonstrate the kind of grace Edmund Caldwell had never managed to show in his own relationships. "Let's hear what she has to say," Gabriel said quietly. They met Anna in the Tannery's small office, the space Gabriel had built from the room where Edmund once managed his dyeing business. Anna looked around with evident surprise at the transformation, at the thriving operation that had grown from the desperate gamble Gabriel had made with his last dollars. "I've been following your success," Anna said, her voice carrying genuine admiration mixed with what might have been regret. The articles about the Tannery's restoration, Paul Hendricks's book, the craft journals featuring Lily's work. "You built something remarkable from nothing." "We built it from desperation," Gabriel corrected. "And from a dead man's hidden fortune. And from refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier." Anna flinched slightly at the implied criticism, but she nodded. "I came to apologize. Not to ask for anything or to try to be part of this, just to say I was wrong. I left when you needed me most, convinced myself that walking away was self-preservation when really it was just cowardice." She turned to Lily. "You were 9 years old, and I abandoned you because I couldn't handle the stress of your father's struggles. That was unforgivable, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed to say it, needed you to know that leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life." Lily was quiet for a long moment, her face showing the kind of careful control she'd learned from years of managing difficult emotions. Finally, she said, "You leaving taught me something important. It taught me that some people quit when things get hard, and other people stand their ground. Dad stood, and I learned to stand by watching him. So maybe your leaving was a gift in a way you didn't intend." The words were gentle but firm, accepting the apology without absolving the abandonment. Anna nodded, tears in her eyes, understanding that some things couldn't be repaired, only acknowledged. After she left, Gabriel and Lily stood together in the office that had once been Edmund's, looking out at the tannery floor where students were learning traditional methods, where knowledge was being preserved and passed forward. The building hummed with purpose, alive in ways it hadn't been since Edmund's death, serving a function that honored what he'd built while adapting to present needs. "Do you think we'll ever see her again?" Lily asked. "I don't know. Maybe. But it doesn't matter as much as it would have once. We've built something here that doesn't depend on her or anyone else. That's what Edmund taught us, that legacy isn't about perfect families or unbroken lines, it's about building something solid enough to survive the people who create it." The years continued their steady progression, each one adding layers to the tannery's story. Students who'd learned traditional tanning there established their own operations, creating a network of craftspeople who valued sustainable methods and quality materials. Some returned to teach, creating continuity that ensured Edmund's knowledge wouldn't die with any single generation. The money had long since been fully spent or invested, its direct impact transformed into infrastructure and programs and scholarships that would outlive the physical currency. But its true value had never been the bills themselves, it had been the breathing room it provided, the space to build something meaningful rather than just survive. Gabriel turned 50 at the Tannery, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the building's resurrection. Former students and current teachers, community members who'd watched the transformation, even Robert and Paul Hendricks who'd made peace with history they couldn't change. The celebration felt less like a birthday party and more like acknowledgement of journey completed, of ground held through stubbornness and grace. Lily gave him a gift that day that made his throat tight, a leather journal she'd made herself using techniques Edmund would have recognized, bound with handmade paper and tooled with patterns that echoed designs in the old ledgers. Inside, she'd written a single dedication, for the man who taught me that standing for something matters more than comfort, and that the best inheritance isn't what you receive but what you choose to build. As evening settled over Millbrook Falls and the celebration wound down, Gabriel walked alone through the Tannery's main floor, his footsteps echoing in spaces that had once been abandoned but now pulsed with purpose. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction, about a hidden chamber and a dead man's trust, about choices made and ground held. The building had been waiting, Edmund's faith extending beyond death, the hidden fortune patient as only buried things can be. Gabriel had found it at his lowest moment, had chosen to honor the trust it represented, had built something that transformed personal salvation into community resource. That was legacy in its truest form, not hoarding what you'd been given but investing it in something larger, not protecting heritage by sealing it away but by keeping it alive through practice and teaching. Edmund had made the mistake of dying alone with his knowledge, but his hidden money had funded the correction of that mistake, had created a place where skills were shared and preserved and passed forward. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that had looked down on this land before the Tannery was built, before Edmund Caldwell had worked his final shift, before Gabriel had placed his desperate bid, before any of the human struggles that had shaped this place. They'd continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the slow work of buildings being restored and knowledge being preserved and families choosing to build rather than destroy. The Tannery stood in the darkness, its windows glowing warm with security lights, its brick walls holding stories that spanned generations. The building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat toxic and abandoned for 40 years, had been reborn through desperation meeting opportunity, through stubbornness meeting grace, through one man's hidden fortune meeting another man's willingness to honor the trust it represented. Gabriel locked the building for the night and walked to the house he'd built beside it, modest but solid, with Lily's workshop attached and students' quarters in the converted storage shed. The property hummed with quiet activity even in evening stillness, alive in ways that honored Edmund's vision while serving needs he couldn't have anticipated. The land kept its secrets still, the creek flowing past as it had for millennia, the oak tree standing where Edmund had buried his key, the soil remembering everything that had happened here.